Some people think they can judge your life before they even know your name, Malcolm thought as he stepped into the modern clinic, the fluorescent lights casting a stark glow over the polished floor and crisp white walls. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the quiet hum of medical equipment filled the space with an almost unnatural calm that contrasted with the storm of thoughts in his mind. He approached the reception desk, where the young clerk barely glanced up from her screen, fingers flying across the keyboard, her expression polite but distant, offering a nod that felt more like a perfunctory acknowledgement than genuine greeting. Malcolm adjusted his coat, straightening the collar, and placed his medical card on the counter, noting the subtle glance from the nurse behind the desk that lingered slightly longer than necessary, as if evaluating more than just the formalities of his appointment. Dr. Ethan Walker, a man whose reputation for precision and authority preceded him, looked up from the chart in his hand, his eyes narrowing fractionally as they met Malcolm's. There was a subtle hesitation in the doctor's gaze, a silent calculation that Malcolm noticed without outward reaction, maintaining a calm demeanor as he prepared to describe the symptoms that had brought him here. "I just need someone to listen," Malcolm muttered under his breath, though loud enough for the faintest echo to reach Dr. Walker's ears, a simple request that felt loaded with the weight of experiences where his words were often filtered through others' biases. As he took a seat in the waiting area, the muted sounds of hushed conversations and the occasional ringing phone underscored the tension, each moment stretching longer than it should, anticipation building as he watched Dr. Walker complete his tasks, the doctor moving with methodical confidence, unaware of the presence of a mind that had navigated the highest courts and understood the nuances of justice. Malcolm's thoughts wandered briefly to the cases he had presided over, the meticulous attention to detail required to discern truth from misperception, and the ironic parallel to this very moment where perception might dictate treatment before understanding could unfold. When his name was called, the voice was neutral, professional, yet Malcolm felt the undercurrent of expectation in the way the words were spoken, a subtle reminder that assumptions often preceded knowledge, and he walked toward the examination room with a steady pace, every step measured, every gesture deliberate, as if each movement reinforced a silent declaration that he was not to be underestimated. He greeted Dr. Walker with a firm but polite nod, the doctor's expression now a mixture of procedural focus and faint curiosity, Malcolm's calm demeanor offering no hint of the authority he carried, the layers of identity hidden beneath a composed exterior, ready to navigate the encounter with precision, mindful that this interaction could reveal character, integrity, and the subtle dynamics of power even before a single word about his health had been spoken, setting the stage for a narrative where assumptions would be challenged, and the true measure of the individuals involved would soon emerge within the sterile, quiet confines of the clinic where every glance, every gesture, and every word would contribute to the unfolding of a story about justice, perception, and the careful balance between authority and understanding, the first step in a sequence of events that would test morals, ethics, and the assumptions that too often guide human judgment. 1-2. Dr. Ethan Walker barely looked up as Malcolm Reed settled into the examination chair, the paper covering beneath him crackling softly in the sterile room illuminated by cold fluorescent light. The doctor clicked through electronic records with practiced speed, his eyes moving more frequently toward the computer screen than toward the man sitting a few feet away. Malcolm folded his hands calmly and waited, noticing how silence seemed to stretch between every question. "What brings you in today?" Ethan asked. The words sounded routine, almost automatic. Malcolm described the persistent symptoms that had been troubling him for weeks, explaining the fatigue, the dizziness that appeared unexpectedly, and the unusual reactions he had begun experiencing during ordinary activities. He spoke clearly, offering specific details, time frames, and observations, the same disciplined precision that had served him throughout decades of legal work. Ethan nodded occasionally but interrupted before Malcolm could finish several explanations. "How long exactly?" he asked. Malcolm answered. Another question followed before the previous answer had fully settled. The doctor typed continuously. His expression remained neutral, yet there was a subtle impatience beneath the surface, a quiet dismissal that Malcolm had encountered before in places where assumptions often arrived before understanding. Ethan performed a brief examination, checking a few standard indicators with efficient movements. The process felt hurried. Instruments touched skin for seconds rather than minutes. Questions seemed designed to confirm conclusions already forming in the doctor's mind rather than explore possibilities. Malcolm noticed it immediately but remained composed. Years in courtrooms had taught him that people often revealed themselves most clearly when they believed nobody was paying attention. The doctor leaned back slightly and glanced again at the chart. "You probably need some lifestyle adjustments," he said. "Better sleep. Less stress." Malcolm listened carefully. The explanation felt incomplete. He had already considered those possibilities. He had already made changes. Yet Ethan appeared uninterested in discussing that history. The doctor asked a few more questions, though each seemed less focused on discovering answers and more focused on ending the appointment efficiently. Outside the room, footsteps echoed through the hallway. A distant phone rang. Somewhere nearby, a printer produced a stack of paperwork. The ordinary sounds of the clinic contrasted with the growing sense that something important was being overlooked. Malcolm calmly clarified several details about his symptoms, hoping the additional information might prompt a deeper evaluation. Instead, Ethan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The doctor nodded once, then returned his attention to the computer. The room felt colder than before. Not because of the temperature but because of the distance that had quietly formed between physician and patient. Malcolm watched as Ethan reviewed laboratory notes and previous records. The doctor's eyes lingered on certain details before moving on without comment. Several times it appeared he might ask a follow-up question. Each time he chose not to. The decision seemed small, almost invisible, yet Malcolm recognized its significance. Care often depended upon curiosity. Curiosity required attention. Attention required respect. As the appointment continued, Ethan's confidence in his own conclusions seemed to grow despite the limited examination. Malcolm remained polite throughout, answering every question directly, offering every detail requested. Still, he could not shake the feeling that the outcome had been decided before the conversation truly began. When Ethan finally turned away from the computer and prepared to discuss treatment options, a faint uneasiness settled in Malcolm's chest. It was not fear. It was instinct. The same instinct that had guided him through countless cases where something beneath the surface did not quite fit, where the facts being presented failed to explain the entire story, and as the doctor reached for the next screen on his computer, the first cracks in a much larger problem quietly began to appear. Dr. Ethan Walker swiveled slightly in his chair and studied the information on his monitor while Malcolm Reed remained seated across from him, hands folded calmly in his lap, the sterile examination room illuminated by a harsh white light that seemed to drain warmth from every surface. For several seconds Ethan said nothing. The silence felt deliberate. His eyes moved from the chart to Malcolm and back again, as though he were comparing two different versions of the same story and had already decided which one he believed. Finally, he cleared his throat and began explaining what he believed was causing the symptoms. The explanation sounded simple. Too simple. Stress, fatigue, lifestyle choices. Ethan delivered the assessment with complete confidence, yet Malcolm could not ignore the fact that several details he had shared moments earlier were absent from the doctor's conclusion. The dizziness, the unusual reactions, the recurring episodes that had grown more frequent. They seemed to have disappeared somewhere between conversation and diagnosis. Malcolm listened politely. He asked a few thoughtful questions. Each time Ethan responded quickly, often before Malcolm had fully finished speaking. The interaction felt less like a medical discussion, and more like a formality moving toward a predetermined outcome. Outside the room, a cart rolled down the hallway. The faint scent of disinfectant drifted beneath the door. The ordinary sounds of the clinic continued uninterrupted while something far less ordinary unfolded inside. Ethan eventually stood and reached for the examination room door. "I will put together a prescription," he said. "This should take care of it." Malcolm nodded, though uncertainty lingered in the back of his mind. As Ethan stepped into the hallway, he nearly collided with Sarah Mitchell, a veteran nurse who had worked at the clinic for more than 15 years. Sarah balanced a tablet in one hand and a stack of paperwork in the other. She glanced toward the examination room before looking at Ethan. "Everything all right?" she asked casually. Ethan shrugged. "Routine case." Sarah noticed the expression on his face. It was subtle, but something felt off. Experience had taught her that medicine was not only about symptoms and treatment plans. It was also about people. She had spent years observing interactions, and occasionally a single glance revealed more than an entire conversation. Ethan walked with her toward the nurse's station. As they moved through the corridor, he briefly summarized Malcolm's condition. Sarah listened carefully. When Ethan mentioned the symptoms, she frowned slightly. "Did you order additional testing?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "Not necessary." Sarah hesitated. "Those symptoms can point to several things." Ethan dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. "Trust me. I have seen this 100 times." The answer should have reassured her. Instead, it increased her discomfort. At the nurse's station, Ethan opened Malcolm's chart again. Sarah stood nearby pretending to organize paperwork while quietly paying attention. She watched his eyes scan the screen. Then she noticed something unusual. Ethan selected a treatment option almost immediately. No additional review. No second look. No consultation. Just a quick decision followed by a few keystrokes. The speed surprised her. Sarah had seen careful physicians spend more time choosing a routine antibiotic. Meanwhile, inside the examination room, Malcolm sat quietly waiting. Through the small window beside the door, he could see shadows moving in the hallway. He checked the time on his watch and reflected on the appointment. The entire experience felt strangely familiar. Not because of the medical concerns, but because of the subtle sense that he had not truly been heard. He had encountered that feeling before in boardrooms, courtrooms, and public spaces where assumptions often arrived before facts. Several minutes later, Ethan returned carrying a printed document. His expression remained confident. His tone remained professional. Yet neither Malcolm nor Sarah realized that the decision Ethan had just made would soon set into motion a chain of events capable of exposing far more than a medical mistake. Malcolm Reed accepted the printed prescription with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the appointment, though the uneasy feeling lingering in the back of his mind had grown stronger. Dr. Ethan Walker stood near the examination room door, one hand resting casually on the handle as he explained the treatment plan. His voice was smooth and confident. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, polished by years of authority. "Take the medication exactly as directed," he said. "You should start feeling better soon." Malcolm glanced down at the paperwork. The medication name meant little to him at first glance. He was not a physician. He was a man seeking medical help from someone trained to provide it. Still, something felt incomplete. The appointment had moved too quickly. Questions had gone unanswered. Concerns had been dismissed with unusual ease. Yet Malcolm simply nodded and folded the prescription neatly into his coat pocket. He thanked Ethan for his time and stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter now. The corridor felt colder. As he walked toward the reception area, Sarah Mitchell noticed him passing by. For a brief moment their eyes met. Sarah offered a polite smile, but her attention immediately shifted to the prescription paper visible in Malcolm's hand. A small knot formed in her stomach. She could not explain it. Years of experience had simply taught her when something deserved a second look. Back at the nurse's station, Ethan returned to his computer. Sarah approached carefully. "What medication did you prescribe?" she asked casually. Ethan barely looked up. He named the drug and continued typing. Sarah's expression tightened slightly. She knew the medication. It was not dangerous when used appropriately, but it was an unusual choice given the symptoms Malcolm had described. "Interesting selection," she said. Ethan shrugged. "It will be fine." Sarah hesitated. "Did you consider the other option?" For the first time, Ethan looked directly at her. The glance lasted only a second, but it carried an unmistakable warning. "I considered everything I needed to consider." Sarah immediately recognized the tone. The conversation was over, at least for him. She stepped away without another word, but concern continued to follow her through the afternoon. Meanwhile, Malcolm exited the clinic and walked into the crisp autumn air. The parking lot shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Cars moved slowly through nearby streets. Ordinary life continued uninterrupted. He paused beside his vehicle and looked again at the prescription before folding it away. The feeling remained. Small. Persistent. Difficult to define. He had spent decades evaluating credibility, weighing evidence and recognizing when something beneath the surface deserved closer examination. Instinct had rarely failed him. As he drove home, The events of the appointment replayed in his mind. The rushed examination. The interruptions. The lack of curiosity. None of it proved wrongdoing. Yet none of it felt right either. Back inside the clinic, Sarah eventually found herself reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station. The screen glowed softly in front of her. She tried focusing on other responsibilities, but Malcolm's case kept returning to her thoughts. Finally, she opened the file again. She reviewed the symptoms. Then she looked at the prescribed treatment. Her eyes narrowed. The discomfort she felt earlier returned immediately. It was stronger now, more specific. She could not yet identify exactly why the decision bothered her, but something about the combination simply did not fit. Across the room, Ethan laughed quietly at a conversation with another physician, completely unconcerned. Sarah closed the file and stared at the monitor for several seconds. Outside, daylight slowly faded toward evening. Inside, a decision made in less than a minute was already beginning to cast a much longer shadow than anyone realized. And neither Malcolm nor Sarah understood that the smallest detail on that prescription would soon expose a truth far more serious than a simple medical disagreement. As Malcolm drove through the city streets, the autumn sunlight glinting off his windshield, he could not shake the uneasy feeling from the clinic. Every turn and stoplight seemed to echo the appointment in his mind, the hurried explanations, the prescription that had felt off, the subtle tension in the air that no one had acknowledged. He replayed the encounter with Dr. Ethan Walker repeatedly, noting how every detail, every casual gesture, and every word carried a weight that did not align with normal medical practice, and though nothing in itself was illegal, Malcolm's instincts, honed by years of careful analysis and keen observation, screamed that something deeper was at play. He pulled into his driveway, a modest suburban home surrounded by trees just beginning to show their fall colors, the leaves rustling gently in the breeze, and stepped out, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs as he retrieved his mail and noticed a small envelope lying on the welcome mat, one he had not expected, addressed in precise, typed lettering that made him pause. Inside, a letter from the medical board notified him that an unusual inquiry had been made regarding his recent visit to Dr. Walker, prompting more questions than answers, and a sense of urgency began to rise as Malcolm processed the implications of this contact. Meanwhile, inside the clinic, Sarah Mitchell, seated at the nurse's station, scanned patient files with a meticulous eye. Her brow furrowed as she considered the medications prescribed and the odd selection made by Dr. Walker, and her mind raced to reconcile the procedural standards she knew with the irregularity she had witnessed earlier, a feeling of discomfort that only sharpened as she noted the subtle patterns in the patient records and the potential consequences if any error or intent had gone unchecked, her heart quickening not from fear but from the weight of responsibility. She stood and walked to the medication storage area, checking stock and cross-referencing prescriptions with thorough care, her movements precise and methodical, aware that every choice could have significant implications. Malcolm, now inside his home, set the letter on the kitchen counter, brewed a cup of coffee, and considered the broader picture, the interplay of authority, trust, and duty, thinking about Dr. Walker's demeanor, the way the conversation had ended abruptly, and how easily such a minor oversight or deliberate action could ripple outward to affect patients, families, and communities in profound ways. As the afternoon stretched into evening, he reviewed notes he had taken on symptoms, treatments, and the prescription, comparing them to the guidelines and medical references he had trusted, and a plan began to form in his mind to seek clarification from another professional, one who could provide perspective and ensure that the proper course of action was taken without undue delay. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, a quiet backdrop to the complex emotions and thoughts that filled both Malcolm and Sarah as they independently worked through the questions, concerns, and moral imperatives presented by what at first appeared as a routine medical visit, but had unfolded into a puzzle, demanding careful reflection, analysis, and response, the weight of ethical responsibility pressing upon them both even as life continued in its normal rhythms, leaving an undercurrent of tension and anticipation that neither could ignore or dismiss. Malcolm sat in his home office, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting slatted shadows across his desk covered in patient charts, medical references, and a half-finished cup of coffee. The weight of the previous visit to Dr. Walker pressed heavily on him, each detail replaying in his mind with clarity, the subtle hesitation in the doctor's voice, the careful placement of medications, and the slight, almost imperceptible smirk that had accompanied the prescription. Instructions. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to process the dissonance between the professionalism expected in healthcare and the odd, unnerving behavior he had witnessed, and he realized that while the initial encounter seemed benign, the implications could be profound, particularly considering his own role and responsibilities as a federal judge who had dedicated a career to fairness and oversight. Simultaneously, Sarah Mitchell, the nurse, moved through the clinic with practiced efficiency, her eyes scanning labels and verifying dosages, her mind alert to inconsistencies and procedural anomalies, aware that a single misstep could have cascading effects on patient safety and institutional accountability, and she paused as she noted an unusual notation in Dr. Walker's patient log. Her curiosity piqued, prompting a careful double-check of the schedule and cross-referencing patient histories with the medications prepared for the day. Her thoughts turning to protocol, ethics, and the invisible thread of trust that bound healthcare professionals to the public. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the trees, a subtle reminder of time's passage as Malcolm reviewed the letter from the medical board once again, highlighting points of inquiry, and making notes about potential follow-up consultations with colleagues, ensuring he approached the situation with diligence and clarity, balancing caution with urgency, knowing that prompt, informed action could prevent harm and maintain confidence in the medical system. The narrative intertwined with Sarah's observations as she considered the chain of responsibility and the potential consequences of overlooked details, her fingers tracing the outlines of the forms, and her eyes narrowing thoughtfully at the intersections of policy and practice, reflecting on how human judgment and error could converge, intentionally or unintentionally, and the necessity of vigilance in every procedural step. Malcolm's mind mapped out scenarios, weighing the probability and impact of each decision, the timing of interventions, and the ethical implications of his next moves, considering both personal and professional consequences, while maintaining a calm exterior, his analytical skills guiding each choice, and reinforcing the principle that understanding, observation, and methodical response could illuminate truths obscured by assumption or bias. Both Malcolm and Sarah, though separated by walls and roles, shared a connection in their commitment to scrutiny, responsibility, and the pursuit of justice, each aware that ordinary routines could harbor extraordinary significance, and that the unfolding situation demanded careful attention, reflection, and measured action to ensure that ethical and professional standards were upheld, leaving a quiet tension that underscored the importance of vigilance, awareness, and integrity in the face of subtle but critical irregularities, shaping the decisions that would guide the next steps in an unfolding, complex scenario. The following morning arrived beneath a gray sky that pressed low over the city, and Sarah Mitchell walked into the clinic carrying a sense of unease she had not been able to shake since the previous day. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Patients filled the waiting room. Phones rang. Printers hummed. Staff exchanged greetings near the coffee station. Yet for Sarah something felt different. She sat at her workstation and opened the electronic records system, telling herself she only wanted reassurance that her concerns were unfounded. Instead, the deeper she looked, the more uncomfortable she became. Malcolm Reed's chart appeared on her screen once again. She reviewed the symptoms. Then she reviewed the prescription. Then she reviewed the notes entered by Dr. Ethan Walker. Several details were missing. Not accidentally overlooked. Missing. Questions Malcolm had answered were not reflected in the documentation. Symptoms that should have prompted additional consideration had been reduced to brief summaries. Sarah leaned back slowly. Experience had taught her that incomplete documentation could create serious problems. Good physicians documented thoroughly because details mattered. Patterns mattered. Context mattered. Yet the chart in front of her seemed unusually selective. Across town, Malcolm sat inside a quiet medical office belonging to an old friend, Dr. Benjamin Carter, a respected specialist who had agreed to review the prescription and medical records. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the desk as Benjamin studied the documents with growing concentration. Malcolm remained silent, watching. He trusted the physician's expertise more than any quick internet search or second-hand opinion. Several minutes passed before Benjamin finally looked up. His expression immediately caught Malcolm's attention. It was not alarm. It was confusion. "Walk me through exactly what happened during the appointment," Benjamin said. Malcolm described the visit from beginning to end. The rushed examination. the interruptions, the prescription. Benjamin listened carefully without speaking. When Malcolm finished, the doctor lowered his eyes to the paperwork again. I would not have chosen this medication based on these symptoms, he said carefully. Malcolm remained calm, though the statement confirmed the instinct that had been growing stronger since leaving the clinic. Could there be a reasonable explanation? He asked. Benjamin hesitated. Possibly. Medicine is complicated. But I would have expected additional testing before reaching this conclusion. The room grew quiet. Malcolm stared through the window at the traffic moving outside. He was not searching for confrontation. He wanted clarity. Nothing more. Back at the clinic, Sarah continued examining records. Then she noticed something that made her pause completely. Another patient file. Similar symptoms. Different treatment plan. She opened a second chart. Then a third. Her eyes narrowed. The pattern was inconsistent. In some cases, Dr. Walker ordered extensive testing. In others, he moved quickly to conclusions. The differences were difficult to explain medically. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. She did not want to believe what her instincts were suggesting. Good healthcare depended on fairness. Trust depended on consistency. Yet the questions continued multiplying. Later that afternoon, Malcolm thanked Benjamin and gathered the documents. Before leaving, he received one final piece of advice. Get answers, Benjamin said. Do not assume intent. Just get answers. Malcolm nodded. The recommendation aligned perfectly with the principles that had guided his entire career. Facts first. Conclusions later. As he walked back to his car, a cool wind swept across the parking lot. He looked down at the prescription once more before folding it carefully into his coat pocket. Somewhere between the clinic, the records, and the unanswered questions, a truth was waiting to be uncovered, and for the first time, both Malcolm and Sarah were moving toward it from opposite directions. The next morning began with a steady rain tapping against the clinic windows, turning the parking lot into a sheet of silver reflections as Sarah Mitchell arrived earlier than usual. She carried a folder in one hand and a growing burden in her thoughts. Throughout the night she had replayed every detail she had discovered, hoping she had overlooked something that would explain the inconsistencies. Instead, the questions had only become sharper. After logging into the system, she reviewed Malcolm Reed's chart once more. Then she compared it against several other patient files with similar symptoms. The differences were impossible to ignore now. Some patients received extensive testing. Others received specialist referrals. Yet Malcolm's evaluation had been shortened, simplified, and closed with unusual speed. Sarah stared at the screen as the glow reflected in her eyes. She was not accusing anyone of wrongdoing. She was searching for understanding, but understanding seemed increasingly difficult to find. Crosstown Malcolm sat inside his study reviewing notes from his conversation with Dr. Benjamin Carter. The specialist's words echoed clearly in his mind. Get answers. Do not assume intent. Just get answers. It was advice Malcolm respected because it mirrored the principles that had guided every major decision of his professional life. Facts first. Conclusions later. He opened a notebook and carefully organized everything he knew. The symptoms. The appointment timeline. The prescription. The second opinion. Each detail occupied its own section. Looking at the information laid out systematically only reinforced one conclusion. Something deserved further examination. By mid-morning, Sarah found herself standing outside Dr. Ethan Walker's office. The door was partially open. Ethan sat behind his desk reviewing patient schedules. For a moment she considered walking away. Then she knocked softly. Ethan glanced up. Everything okay? He asked. Sarah stepped inside. I wanted to ask about a patient from yesterday. Ethan immediately seemed less interested. Which one? She mentioned Malcolm's case. A subtle shift crossed Ethan's face. It lasted less than a second, but Sarah noticed it. What about it? He asked. Sarah carefully explained her concerns regarding the treatment plan and the lack of additional testing. Ethan leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. The case was straightforward. His tone carried finality. Sarah remained calm. Maybe, but I am struggling to understand some of the documentation. Ethan's expression hardened. Then trust my judgment. The room fell silent. Sarah nodded politely and left, But the conversation accomplished the opposite of what Ethan intended. Instead of easing her concerns, it deepened them. Later that afternoon, Malcolm made a decision. Rather than filing complaints or making accusations, he would return to the clinic and ask direct questions. Nothing confrontational. Nothing dramatic. Simply questions. If there was a reasonable explanation, he wanted to hear it. If there was not, the answers would reveal that as well. As evening approached, clouds drifted apart and sunlight finally broke through the rain. At the clinic, Sarah prepared to leave. For the day. Before shutting down her computer, she opened Malcolm's file one final time. Her eyes moved across the screen until they landed on a notation she had not noticed before. A brief entry. Only a few words. Yet those words immediately caused her pulse to quicken. She read them twice to make certain she was not mistaken. Then she sat back slowly, staring at the monitor. For the first time, her concerns no longer felt like intuition. They felt like evidence, and somewhere across the city, Malcolm was preparing to walk back into the clinic, unaware that both of them were now only one step away from uncovering a truth that neither Dr. Walker nor anyone else expected to come to light. Malcolm Reed entered the clinic with a quiet determination, the sunlight from the afternoon casting long warm streaks across the polished floors, and each step resonated with a rhythm of purpose, aware that the documents Sarah Mitchell had discovered were likely to change everything. He paused outside the door to Dr. Walker's office, took a deep breath, and recalled the calm, methodical way he had approached his military duties, reminding himself that patience and clarity would guide this interaction. Then he stepped inside, greeted the receptionist politely, and asked to speak directly with the doctor about his prescription. While Sarah observed from a distance, her notebook open, fingers poised to capture any critical details, the tension in the room palpable but subdued, Malcolm maintained a composed expression, calmly outlining his observations about the inconsistencies he had noted, the irregularities in the medication schedule, and the lack of follow-up procedures compared to standard protocol. Dr. Walker responded with measured, precise language, emphasizing routine checks and standard medical procedures. Yet Malcolm's questions were pointed, professional, designed to uncover patterns rather than assign blame. Sarah jotted down the timestamps, the subtle gestures, the small pauses, each one potentially significant as the conversation unfolded. Dr. Walker, realizing that Malcolm was not merely a patient but a person trained to evaluate situations with acute tension to detail, adjusted his tone, providing explanations that were technically sound but revealing inconsistencies in logic and procedure. Sarah noticed how Malcolm's calm insistence gently pressured Dr. Walker into revealing the underlying decision-making processes, neither confrontational nor accusatory, just factual inquiries seeking clarity. Outside the office, the rain began to fall softly, a gentle backdrop to the high-stakes dialogue inside. Malcolm cross-referenced each answer with the notes he had prepared earlier, his methodical approach ensuring no detail would be overlooked. The conversation gradually shifted from a defensive posture to an analytical one as Dr. Walker responded to the precision of Malcolm's questions. Sarah realized that the intersection of authority, professional expertise, and ethical responsibility was playing out before her eyes, each exchange revealing subtle truths about intent, procedure, and the human element of medical care. As the dialogue concluded, Malcolm summarized his findings, noting which explanations aligned with protocol and which required further review. Dr. Walker acknowledged the need for documentation, and Sarah closed her notebook, the significance of the session evident, realizing they were all part of a delicate balance between oversight, accountability, and professional integrity, with the next steps poised to determine how the errors or intentions behind the prescription would be addressed, setting the stage for revelations that could affect not just one patient but potentially the entire approach to clinical oversight, leaving a quiet but impactful tension in the room as Malcolm prepared to leave, the future implications clear in the careful observations each had made during this pivotal meeting. The next morning, Malcolm Reed stood in the quiet of his office, the early sunlight reflecting off the polished wood floors, the papers neatly organized on his desk, his mind already replaying the events from the clinic the previous day. While Sarah Mitchell observed from her side of the room, her notebook open and pen poised, ready to document the unfolding developments. The atmosphere was tense yet focused as Malcolm methodically reviewed the sequence of medications prescribed and the deviations he had noted, tracing each step back to its origin, analyzing how each small error could have significant consequences, and considering the human factors, the subtle judgments and assumptions that had influenced the choices made by Dr. Walker, all while maintaining his calm, measured demeanor, and ensuring that his professional approach was thorough and unassailable, Sarah making careful notes on his observations and insights, the weight of responsibility clear in her attentive posture. Malcolm began calling the relevant medical offices, scheduling discussions and requesting records, ensuring that all the necessary documentation would be compiled to understand the full scope of the situation. As he spoke, his voice was steady and precise, reflecting his years of experience handling complex procedural investigations, while Sarah recorded every detail, aware that each note might later serve as critical evidence. The dialogue between them was punctuated by thoughtful pauses, as Malcolm reflected on each answer, cross-referencing it with previous knowledge, and considering alternative interpretations, the afternoon sun shifting across the room as they worked, bringing subtle changes in light that mirrored the gradual unfolding of clarity in their understanding. By mid-afternoon, they had traced inconsistencies, identified gaps in procedure, and outlined the steps necessary to prevent future errors. Malcolm explaining each decision with precise reasoning, highlighting the importance of verification, ethical responsibility, and vigilance in medical practice. Sarah noting the interconnections, the way human judgment intersects with procedural oversight, and the importance of documenting intent versus action. As the day drew to a close, they both felt the weight of what had been uncovered, and the critical need to ensure transparency and accountability, understanding that their meticulous efforts were essential not only to address the immediate concerns, but also to reinforce standards and practices that protect patients and maintain professional integrity. The room silent except for the sound of pens on paper and phones clicking through appointments. Malcolm finally leaned back in his chair, eyes thoughtful, knowing that the work ahead would require continued diligence, collaboration, and clear communication, while Sarah quietly reflected on the complexity of human decision-making and the responsibility inherent in documenting truth, the day closing with a sense of purpose and resolve, a commitment to thorough investigation, ethical accountability, and the pursuit of clarity in every action taken. The conference room overlooking the city skyline felt unusually quiet that morning. The kind of silence that appeared when people realized a routine review had become something far more serious. Representatives from the clinic administration sat around the long polished table, while folders, printed reports, and electronic records filled the screens mounted along the wall. Sarah Mitchell sat near the end of the table, her notebook resting unopened beside her. She no longer needed reminders. Every detail of the case had become impossible to forget. Across the room, Dr. Ethan Walker maintained a professional posture, though the confidence that had once come so easily now seemed strained. The internal review team had spent days examining documentation, comparing records, and verifying timelines. Questions that initially appeared minor had produced answers that raised even larger concerns. Missing details, inconsistent notes, treatment decisions that did not align with standard procedures. No one was making accusations yet, but the atmosphere had changed. Facts were beginning to speak for themselves. Then the lead administrator entered carrying a new folder. The room immediately grew still. She thanked everyone for attending, and explained that additional background information had been verified that morning. Ethan barely looked up at first. He seemed more interested in the stack of documents in front of him. Sarah noticed the moment everything changed. The administrator opened the folder and continued. There is one detail regarding the patient that became relevant during our review process. Ethan finally raised his eyes. The administrator calmly stated Malcolm Reed's full professional title. For several seconds nobody moved. The words seemed to hang in the air. Federal Judge Malcolm Reed. The room remained silent. Ethan blinked once. Then again. His expression did not collapse dramatically. Instead, it shifted in a far more revealing way. Surprise first. Then disbelief. Then something else. Recognition. Sarah watched carefully. She realized that until that moment Ethan had viewed Malcolm as simply another patient whose concerns could be dismissed without consequence. Now the assumptions underlying that decision had nowhere left to hide. The administrator continued speaking, explaining that Malcolm's position had not influenced the review. In fact, investigators had intentionally avoided considering it until the medical facts were fully established. The evidence stood on its own. That point seemed important to everyone present. Malcolm was not receiving special treatment because of his title. The review existed because legitimate questions had emerged. The title simply revealed how little anyone had truly known about the man sitting in the examination room that day. Sarah thought back to Malcolm's calm demeanor during every interaction. He had never mentioned his career, never demanded special consideration, never attempted to use status or influence. He had simply asked questions and waited for honest answers. Across the table, Ethan stared at the documents. For the first time since the investigation began, he appeared uncertain about what to say. The administrator outlined the next phase of the review process. Additional interviews would follow. Further documentation would be examined. Recommendations would eventually be presented to the board. Every step would be transparent. Every conclusion would be supported by evidence. As the meeting ended, people slowly gathered their papers and prepared to leave. Through the tall windows, sunlight reflected off nearby buildings, casting bright patterns across the conference room floor. Sarah remained seated for a moment longer, watching as the participants exited one by one. The revelation had changed everything, yet in another sense it had changed nothing at all. The real issue had never been who Malcolm Reed was. The real issue was how he had been treated when nobody thought he was anyone important. And now that truth was finally impossible to ignore. The hospital corridor buzzed with a low hum of activity, nurses and assistants moving efficiently between rooms, the scent of antiseptic lingering faintly in the air. Dr. Ethan Walker walked at a measured pace, his expression composed, yet beneath it, a simmering awareness of the previous revelation lingered. Every glance at a patient file reminded him that assumptions could be dangerous, that authority carried weight beyond initial appearances. In the waiting area, Sarah Mitchell reviewed her notes, her fingers tracing details she had already memorized, analyzing the timeline, checking each fact against previous observations. The announcement that morning had shifted the context of every interaction. Malcolm Reed was no ordinary patient. The knowledge transformed the perception of each event, each decision. Staff members moved with the same precision as before, but the awareness that one patient's identity could so radically change interpretation of prior actions settled over the environment like a shadow. In the adjacent examination room, Malcolm's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the subtle tension around him. He had spoken softly, clearly, articulating his concerns without demanding special treatment, demonstrating a poise that was increasingly remarkable in the context of the unfolding review. Dr. Walker reflected on every interaction, recognizing now the inadvertent biases that could have influenced even minor judgments, decisions once thought routine now seen under a harsher, more exacting light. Sarah noted the meticulous record-keeping, how every nurse's observation had been recorded, every discrepancy logged, providing a backbone for analysis that could withstand scrutiny. Outside, the sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the pale green walls and the polished linoleum floor, creating sharp reflections that mirrored the clarity emerging in the ongoing investigation. Conversations between administrative staff were cautious, measured, each word selected to maintain professionalism, while addressing the unforeseen complexity of the case. Ethan approached a chart stand, scanning the vitals of patients in the adjacent rooms, noting patterns, ensuring that no routine detail escaped review. The realization that Malcolm's position as a federal judge was irrelevant to the medical facts underscored the impartiality required in assessment, yet also highlighted the profound responsibility inherent in every decision made, both clinically and administratively. Sarah's pen moved rapidly across the page, capturing the evolving narrative, the subtle shifts in tone, the acknowledgments of oversight, the moments where procedure and protocol intersected with human error. Dr. Walker paused to confer quietly with a colleague, discussing procedural corrections, ensuring transparency and accountability. The day continued with a blend of routine and revelation, the ordinary actions of staff punctuated by the extraordinary context of one patient's identity. Malcolm remained composed, observing, listening, his presence a constant reminder that integrity and professionalism must align, that each decision reverberates beyond immediate perception. As the afternoon advanced, the hospital environment maintained its rhythm, yet beneath the surface, a profound awareness had been instilled, a recalibration of judgment and assumption, a recognition that every patient, regardless of perceived status, demanded attentive, unbiased consideration, and that the unfolding narrative of care, oversight, and responsibility would guide actions for days to come. The morning light streamed through the hospital windows, casting a warm glow across the orderly rooms and corridors, highlighting the quiet determination on the faces of the medical staff as they moved with practiced precision. Dr. Ethan Walker stood at the threshold of the operating suite, taking a slow, deliberate breath, reflecting on the intricate web of events that had led to this moment, each decision and observation carrying weight far beyond the clinical, as the patient, Malcolm Reed, adjusted his gown and prepared with remarkable calm, his posture radiating confidence and focus. That contrasted with the subtle tension lingering in the atmosphere. Nurses coordinated seamlessly, checking instruments and vitals, their movements synchronized, each action measured, deliberate, demonstrating an unspoken awareness of the gravity of the situation, the stakes underscored by the patient's status as a federal judge, which demanded that every procedure, every protocol be executed flawlessly. Dr. Walker consulted the chart once more, confirming details, reviewing the medications, double-checking the timelines, his mind running through contingencies, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. Malcolm's eyes met his briefly, a calm acknowledgement passing between them, a silent understanding of the professionalism expected, and the trust implicit in the patient-doctor relationship. Outside the suite, Sarah Mitchell observed from a distance, notes in hand, documenting each step, her analytical mind tracking the flow of events, the sequence of care, ready to provide insight if required, aware of the subtle pressures influencing decision-making, and the responsibility that accompanied any deviation from standard practice. The hospital's corridors echoed softly with footsteps and distant announcements, underscoring the contrast between the routine rhythm of daily operations and the extraordinary context unfolding within this particular room. The medical team proceeded with steady precision, monitoring monitors, adjusting instruments, their expressions focused, reflecting a commitment to accuracy, diligence, and care. Dr. Walker addressed each staff member with clear instructions, reinforcing protocol, maintaining communication that was calm yet commanding, ensuring that every aspect of preparation and procedure met the highest standards of practice, the patient's well-being the central priority. Throughout the room, the interplay of subtle gestures, careful glances, and professional coordination created an environment charged with anticipation yet guided by expertise, where the stakes were understood, the responsibilities clear, and the commitment to proper conduct absolute. As the procedure progressed, every movement, every decision underscored the themes of accountability, precision, and ethical responsibility, highlighting the importance of treating each patient with impartial attention while recognizing the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this case. By mid-morning, the team's efficiency and cohesion had established a rhythm that balanced technical skill, careful judgment, and patient-centered focus, ensuring that the events of the day would be handled with integrity, meticulous care, and professional diligence, and leaving a lasting impression of the critical importance of fairness, diligence, and unwavering attention to detail in every clinical action, and in the ways that each professional choice reverberates beyond the immediate environment, guiding both current outcomes and future practices.